Integrating large language models into the enterprise exposes our hidden cognitive vulnerabilities. The machine acts as a diagnostic mirror, reflecting the narrative-craving architecture of the human mind with uncomfortable clarity. For centuries, the business world operated on a singular assumption. Human consciousness was the gold standard of rational decision-making. We believed that because we could deliberate and explain our choices, we were purely rational actors. Placing the human operating system next to a large language model breaks that assumption. We are not pure logic engines. We are slow, meaning-making organisms forced to operate alongside high-speed probability machines. The differences are structural. The human system constantly rushes to judgment to protect its ego and avoid the anxiety of the unknown. We force singular narratives onto random data because we crave certainty. The LLM, possessing no ego, calculates infinite probability distributions without experiencing psychological threat. Before you can safely lead an AI-integrated organization, you must confront this uncomfortable truth. You are operating a mechanical, highly self-deceiving emotional system. We operate under the illusion of a unified I, a permanent self making deliberate decisions in real time. The neurobiological reality is quite different. We are mechanical. Human cognition is driven by 4 semi-independent processors: the intellectual, moving, instinctive, and emotional centers. Each has its own distinct logic, and more importantly, its own specific processing speed. The intellectual center, the rational mind executives rely on, is the slowest system. The emotional center operates 900 million times faster, processing threats instantly. This system runs its cycle before the rational mind even acknowledges the event. The biological implication for leadership is severe. By the time your rational mind registers a crisis, your emotional center has recognized the threat, flooded your system with neurochemicals, and initiated a physical response. In high-intensity moments, the rational mind is perpetually lagging. Because it operates at a fraction of the speed of your emotions, it doesn't initiate the response. It merely narrates a biological program that is already in progress. To understand how this high-speed emotional machine overrides rational thought, we look to the neurobiology of threat detection. When sensory input detects a threat, the signal travels directly to the amygdala. This low road triggers a massive stress response instantly, an amygdala hijack. The slower rational assessment travels the high road, arriving after executive hardware is offline. This creates a strict operational rule. Any logical argument during an active hijack will simply fail. The receiving hardware is effectively biologically disabled. However, the chemical surge driving this hijack has a strict biological half-life. There is a physical gap between the initial stimulus and the moment your rational brain re-engages. That physical gap is the 6-second window. It is the precise time frame where an executive must apply controlled box breathing or cognitive reappraisal. You cannot prevent the initial surge, but you can successfully intercept it before the hijack completes its cycle. Executive restraint isn't about suppressing human emotion. It's a surgical intervention during a 6-second biological window. One specific intervention forces the prefrontal cortex back online: affect labeling. This is a clinical strategy used to actively shift blood flow away from an overactive amygdala. The mechanism is direct. When you experience chaotic physiological arousal, forcing your brain to select a precise word to name that emotion acts as a linguistic filter. The cognitive effort required to process language disrupts the runaway emotional signal. But this tool carries a warning. Affect labeling is subject to the intensity paradox. This graph illustrates how explicitly naming an emotion drives down distress for high-intensity threats. However, for minor annoyances, applying a label acts as semantic priming, causing the distress metric to spike. The rule of thumb is strict. Reserve analytical labeling for high-stakes crises. For minor frictions, rely on passive observation. Notice the frustration, but do not diagnose it. Upgrading your executive operating system requires more than learning a psychological technique. It requires knowing exactly when that tool becomes destructive. This neurobiology does not exist in a vacuum. It scales directly to the organization, shaping the collective emotional commons. Groups regulate emotion differently than individuals. Collective resilience relies on the unscripted friction of human interaction. It requires shared histories, specific cultural nuances, and mutual vulnerability to function. When leaders outsource daily emotional rituals, like team check-ins or condolences, to AI-generated drafts, they introduce a critical vulnerability: pseudo-intimacy. The group simulates connection without the labor required to sustain it. AI models optimize language for a mathematical median. This flattens emotional nuance. The complex ambivalence and specific shared references that anchor real relationships are systematically overwritten by perfectly uniform, generic phrasing. The consequences compound silently until a crisis hits. The team feels a superficial sense of connection, but because the daily friction of genuine care was automated away, the unmediated support networks required for actual recovery do not exist. Leveraging AI to remove the friction from interpersonal communication engineers profound structural fragility into the organization. Navigating the age of artificial intelligence does not require rejecting the technology. It demands a new dual capability: double literacy. This practice is structured through Walther's A-frame for algorithmic literacy, a foundational risk mitigation protocol designed for AI-mediated environments. The first two pillars are awareness and appreciation. Awareness is the conscious recognition that automation carries a human cost. Appreciation is the active decision to protect your organization's specific emotional vocabulary against algorithmic homogenization. The final two pillars are acceptance and accountability. You must acknowledge that your digital inputs are shaped by systems optimizing for engagement, and hold yourself accountable for committing manual effort to the communications that matter most. The mandate for leaders is to conduct an emotional diagnostic audit. You must locate the exact points in your workflow where your humanity has been quietly automated away and deliberately reclaim them. Efficiency and calculation are now the domain of the machine. Leadership, however, remains rooted in the unmediated human connection, the one friction automation cannot replicate.